Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 555, The Gods March Overseas, Part 1. We're going to start this week with a bit of a digression, but I promise it's going to be worth it, despite the fact that it will take up about half the episode, actually. You see, our episodes on Reiki got me thinking about a question I've been grappling with on and off for a couple of years now. When you get right down to it, what exactly is religion? It seems straightforward enough. I imagine if you told most people in the world, I don't know what you mean by religion, you'd be looked at like you're a bit crazy. We all know what religion is. It's some combination of belief, ritual, sacred spaces, all that stuff. But when you actually dig into it, things become kind of challenging from a definitional perspective. Just as an example, Reiki, of course, involves a belief in the supernatural, a metaphysical cosmic order that, as much as Takata Hawaiō sometimes claimed various forms of pseudoscience did confirm it, is not actually verifiable scientifically. So is Reiki a religion? She would have probably said no, though arguably that is cynically because calling it a religion would have lessened its appeal to her Christian students. More broadly, if you look at the history of humanity, the sheer range of beliefs that we have lumped into the idea of religion is absolutely overwhelming. From the Roman Republic's practice of, in essence, worship of the state itself, to the largely secularized religious metaphysics of Confucianism, with its generally vague cosmic order of heaven, to Hinduism, a singular religion incorporating a massive number of belief systems, some of which are arguably monotheistic, to everything in between. Our modern notion of what religion is largely a historically defined one created in the West by the destructive conflicts that emerge out of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the 150-plus years of war known, rather uncreatively, as the Wars of Religion, the largest and most devastating of these wars being the equally uncreatively named 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648. In the aftermath of that particular war, as part of the treaties ending these conflicts, most notably the massive Treaty of Westphalia, the rulers of Europe agreed on a scheme that helped to create, in a sense, the idea of religion as it exists today. That notion of religion is that it is a deeply personal belief that one holds close to their heart, but which is separate, distinct from any social or political roles that we play. That religion is a sort of separate social category that is wholly personal, to do with our individual relationship with God/the gods/the divine/whatever, however we choose to structure them. To put it another way, the Treaty of Westphalia established the idea that a subject or a citizen only owes their rulers duties that are secular. Pay your taxes, obey the law, honor the king or the government, that sort of thing. That's the only stuff the government can compel you to do. On the flip side, the state does not, in this way of thinking, have the authority to compel you to believe something, to force you to go to a specific church, pray a certain way, whatever. Those things are private. They are between you and, once again, whatever your notion of God or the gods or the divine is. Now, over time, two important things happened to this Westphalian concept of religion, as we might call it. First, of course, what counted as a religion broadened. Of course, at first, European rulers were only concerned with the different sects of Christianity, but over the course of the European Enlightenment, their rulers came to extend the same hands-off attitude, first to the other Abrahamic religions of Judaism and Islam, and then to all religions. Second, the Westphalian attitude of religion was carried all around the world at gunpoint during the Age of Imperialism. As European and American colonies were forcibly civilized at gunpoint, or as uncolonized states worked frantically to civilize themselves to avoid being taken over, they began to assimilate Western notions about what religion was and how religion worked, which, after all, were part and parcel of the worldview that, in the conception of the 1800s, was the only realistic and, again, genuinely civilized way to do things. Whenever we talk about religion today, we bring along all of this historical baggage, which makes defining what we mean by religion a very hard task, because it turns out a definition derived from a very specific moment in both the history of Christianity and the history of European geopolitics is not well suited to the huge variety of different beliefs that can exist outside of that. As one excellent scholar of this subject, Dr. Carly Shimizu, puts it, it's very hard to come up with a definition of religion today that is simultaneously open enough to incorporate every world religion and also specific enough to exclude, say, a sports fandom or an ideology like Marxism-Leninism. I mean, hell, if religion is just strong convictions about something you practice in a communal space, maybe being a fan of an NFL football team is functionally America's state religion. And of course, this is all fascinatingly theoretical, but you're probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with Japanese history? And the answer is that this argument over what we mean when we say religion was of course a part of the whole turbulence of Japan's own modernization. The Meiji government, inaugurated by a group of samurai rebels in the ostensible name of Japan's 122nd emperor, tasked itself with saving Japan from the depredations of Western empires. It would do this by bringing the country civilization and enlightenment, Bunmei Kaika, as that classic Meiji-era slogan went. But what does that actually mean? As we've covered, much of the action of the early Meiji years was about vigorous debates to try and determine exactly that, in spheres ranging from politics to the arts to the economy to basically everything else. And the idea of religion, whatever exactly we mean by that, was not spared this withering introspection. Japan entered into the Meiji era with a long religious tradition, so how did that tradition adapt itself to this new model of thinking about what religion even is? And more importantly, once Japan became an imperial power itself, how did these new notions of religion help to support the growth of the Japanese empire? First, of course, we should remind ourselves of some good old-fashioned historical context. Japan, of course, has two primary traditions you might call religious. The first of these is what we now call Shinto, though as I am legally obligated to remind you every time we discuss this, that word is an anachronism and did not exist until the Meiji era. I am also legally obligated to remind you that Shinto flows a lot more easily than loosely organized native animistic mythic traditions and attached rituals, or something like that, so I am just going to use Shinto to refer to the whole history of this tradition. The other tradition, of course, is Buddhism, an import from the Asian mainland back in the 500s CE. But for most of Japanese history, these were not separate religious traditions in the way we think of separate religions today. Buddhism and Shinto coexisted, often quite literally in the same spaces, with shrines sharing grounds with temples and vice versa, and a whole complex theology existing to link the gods of Shinto into the Buddhist pantheon. Buddhism generally had the air of being a more elite religion, though by the Middle Ages, sects like Nichiren and the various Pure Land groups had popularized it outside of the aristocracy. But you didn't really have to be strictly one or the other. Neither Buddhism nor Shinto has what you'd call an exclusivist theology. Both of these faiths, meanwhile, were under the supervision of the state. Government bureaucracy to regulate religious affairs was a feature of every Japanese government up to and through the early years of the Meiji period, both to ensure temples and shrines followed various rules governing their behavior, and to ensure that their religious energies were directed towards good ends, offering prayers for the well-being of the state itself, and not negative, subversive ones. This was, in a word, a very non-Westphalian religious system. Religion was not a separate personal sphere of life. It was a deeply political one entwined with every other aspect of the system. I mean, it's worth remembering that one of the most important political moments of the final years of the Tokugawa shogunate, when Emperor Komei broke the rule around emperors leaving the grounds of the imperial palace in Kyoto, occurred because Komei wanted to go do something very political. He wanted to pray at the Kamo shrines for the expulsion of the foreigners, a very political act that we might also call religious. The Tokugawa regime, of course, went down in flames in 1868, and its successor in the Meiji government began to revamp many of the ideas it inherited from the old regime, including ideas about religion. It took a while for the Meiji government to settle on a model of religion that was suitable for the new Japan and its goals of civilization and enlightenment. In fact, in the first decade of Meiji rule, the state took on a very different approach to religion than what it would eventually settle on. The coalition of samurai, aristocrats, and others who led the overthrow of the Tokugawa shoguns included a good number of what we might call Shinto nationalists, whose primary goal in overthrowing the shogunate was winding the clock back to what they saw as a purer moment in Japanese history. Their explicit goal was to bring Japan back to the governing philosophies and structures of the classical era almost 1,000 years earlier, with the emperor's rule being based on divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. They also aimed to weaken the power of Buddhism as a religion specifically. Buddhism was closely associated with Tokugawa rule because the shogun had mandated that everyone register as a parishioner of their local Buddhist temple as part of the anti-Christian edicts. The Shinto nationalists were successful in pushing through some policies. For example, a legal mandate to separate Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples in order to more clearly distinguish the two religions, and to end many of the special legal and tax privileges Buddhist temples had once enjoyed. They were even able to encourage some dubiously legal anti-Buddhist rioting and legislation in parts of the country. The so-called Haibutsu-Kishaku movement, abolish Buddhism, destroy Shakyamuni, is what that means in English. Taking advantage of popular anger against the perceived privilege accorded to these Buddhist institutions, these men encouraged attacks on Buddhist temples or legal changes to strip away their revenue, hoping in essence to promote Shinto as a social and political force by breaking down its primary competition. The precise number of temples that closed as a result of this campaign is unclear, but there are estimates in the thousands. These Shinto nationalists also promoted something called the Great Promulgation Campaign, aimed at spreading a reformulated version of Shinto around Japan, one that was more explicitly a national religion and completely divorced from Buddhism. The Great Promulgation Campaign was based around three teachings, or Sanjo no Kyosoku in Japanese. Those teachings were reverence for the kami, the gods, and love of country, keishin aikoku in Japanese, the principle of heavenly principles and human ethics, tenri jindo in Japanese, basically, your ethical beliefs should coincide with what the gods want for you, and finally, reverence for the emperor and adherence to the wishes of the court, kojo hotai choshi junshu. In combination, so the thinking went, these principles would make the people moral subjects of the imperial throne while protecting them from mistaken ideas, including Buddhism, but most importantly, the now legal but still much maligned subversive religion of Christianity. However, the Great Promulgation Campaign didn't go anywhere. Attempts to centralize and rationalize Shinto teaching ran up against a lot of resistance from the shrines themselves, which were jealous of their own authority over beliefs related to their specific shrine, and while Buddhism was weakened as an institutional force by the campaigns against it, there were still plenty of believers out there. In fact, many of the popular Buddhist sects had initially supported the Great Promulgation Campaign, most notably the Jodo Shinshu, or True Pure Land sect, hoping to draw clearer lines between their own theologies and the beliefs of Shinto. However, many of these sects then pulled their support as the campaign became more explicitly anti-Buddhist. There's also no getting around the fact, frankly, that the actual teachings of the Great Promulgation Campaign were pretty weak. When you boil them down, they're pretty much just do what the emperor wants and be patriotic, and that's not really something you can build your whole sort of ethical worldview around. By the mid-1870s, the Great Promulgation Campaign had been abandoned, and most of the Shinto nationalist wing of the Meiji government leadership had either died or retired in disgrace when the whole thing failed to go anywhere. As we know, the winners of the struggle for power in the Meiji system, the ones who really got to define what the Meiji government would be, were a group of former samurai who you might call autocratic modernizers. People like Ito Hirobumi, Inoue Kaoru, and Yamagata Aritomo, whose version of civilization and enlightenment meant the westernization of political, economic, and social structures, and the construction of a powerful centralized new government to oversee this new order. This faction of the Meiji leadership viewed religion very much from the Westphalian perspective. This was a personal affair, and it had no effect on the obligations that you owed to the state. Or maybe that's not entirely fair to say that's how they saw religion. More accurately, they were just Westernizers who were committed to proving to the international community that Japan was a modern state and deserved to be accepted into the family of the elite Western imperial powers. They were willing to impose pretty much any reform they thought would help prove that point. Thus, for example, the constitution for the Japanese Empire that these men wrote, which went into effect in 1889, included the following in its 28th article. Japanese subjects shall, within limits not prejudicial to peace and order, and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects, enjoy freedom of religious belief. This is basically a Western notion of what religious belief is, a matter of your personal conviction, separate from the secular affairs of government, in which you should have unrestricted freedom. But of course, this new arrangement always rested a bit uneasy with the Meiji leadership. Its leaders were hesitant to cede too much independence on this area to their subjects, as that caveat about within limits not prejudicial to peace and order and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects makes very clear. So while the new government granted religious freedom to its subjects, its leaders were also aware of the fact that their own government was grounded in a type of religious legitimacy. After all, the preamble to this constitution, written from the perspective of the Meiji emperor, reiterated that he had, quote, ascended the throne of a lineal succession unbroken for ages eternal, and that he had inherited sovereign rule over Japan, quote, from our ancestors, and we shall bequeath it to our descendants. In a speech before the constitution was officially promulgated to the public, the emperor reiterated this constitution was not a break from the Japanese past, but a culmination of the principles upon which the rule of Japan's imperial family had always rested. As a result, this grafting of a Westphalian notion of religion into Japan's Meiji-era context was always a little messy, creating, in essence, a sort of threefold ideological divide between the areas of religion, secularism, and superstition, that last one meaning any beliefs associated with an unrecognized religion. As Dr. Carly Shimizu puts it, quote, in Meiji period Japan, superstitions were targeted for elimination by the government. Meanwhile, religion as a category protected and recognized religions from persecution while limiting their influence by relegating them to a private sphere that was not allowed in schools or in politics. The secular, on the other hand, was considered universal to all imperial subjects and formed the ideological basis of the state. The balance between these three categories was always a bit tenuous, and this brings us, at long last, to the subject for the next couple of weeks. You see, the reason I find these questions around the role of religion so interesting from the specific perspective of Japanese history is that when we think of the Japanese Empire at its apex, we often conceive of it, at least in part, in religious terms. An empire that was undergirded by the ideas of state Shinto, of a government-backed national Shinto religion that included religious veneration of the imperial throne. And that is absolutely a core component of the ideology underlying the imperial state, despite the fact that if you look at the history, that mindset would seem incompatible with the Westphalian notion of religion that Meiji Japan inherited from the outside world, with all that emphasis on faith as a purely individual matter, and on, as we say now, the separation of church, or I guess shrine, and state. So we're going to look at this tension, how it came to be, specifically by looking at the role Shinto played in the empire itself. Today, we're going to focus a bit on Shinto in the home islands, and specifically one shrine whose history is very revealing of this whole tension. Starting next week, we're going to look at Shinto in Japan's overseas colonies. And as you're probably already beginning to suspect based on how much I'm quoting her, much of these episodes will be built around the framework provided by Carly Shimizu's book Overseas Shinto Shrines, which is focused on exactly this subject, the role of Shinto as a religion, even though the government doesn't want to call it a religion, in the Japanese Empire. So, what are we doing for the rest of this episode? Well, we're going to look at the history again of one specific shrine in Japan proper, which plays an important role in Shinto mythology, and therefore offers us an interesting through line to explore how the shrines themselves navigated the complexities of this whole debate around what religion is. That shrine is Kashihara Jingu in Nara Prefecture. As we all know from our fervent fandom of Japan's ancient mytho-histories, Kashihara is supposedly the site upon which Japan's first emperor, Jimmu, built his capital. It's the foundational site of the Yamato state itself. Of course, it's pretty clear the first emperor Jimmu is a historical invention. His story is entirely mythologized, and certainly the founding date of 660 BCE, given for the establishment of his kingdom, is pretty dubious given that there's no real evidence of a distinct Yamato kingdom until about 800 years later than that. Still, the timing might be off and the person might be off, but Kashihara as a location is probably pretty close to spot on in terms of where the Yamato kingdom, what became the government of Japan's emperors, was founded. As we covered back in episode 501, the imperial family probably originated from the vicinity of Mount Miwa in Nara Prefecture, which is only about 13 kilometers or 8 miles from what's now Kashihara Shrine. Despite this rather impressive pedigree, for most of its history, Kashihara as a town was largely ignored in religious terms. There were no shrines there, no major ones I should say, and other sacred spaces related to the imperial family, such as the Grand Shrine of Ise, were much better known. It was not until the late Tokugawa years that Kashihara started to gain any degree of prominence, largely because of the growing Kokugaku movement. It's been a while since we've talked about these guys, so for a quick refresh, this was an intellectual movement of the late Tokugawa years associated with the lower samurai and the upper levels of the peasantry, which purported to be fixed on rediscovering the unique essence of Japanese civilization, uncorrupted by external influences. That unique essence was in turn often conflated with the imperial family. It was Kokugaku scholars who began to press for Kashihara as a site to receive some degree of government recognition. And as an aside, it was also Kokugaku scholars who were the main source of the Shinto nationalists who promoted the Great Promulgation Campaign. Anyway, the Tokugawa shogunate would eventually grant Kashihara some degree of recognition. In 1863, conscious of the sentiment that the shogunate had been disrespectful to the imperial throne and the emperor, the government decided to designate one of the kofun, the large earthen tombs associated with the imperial family in its earliest years, as the tomb of the first emperor Jimmu himself. To be clear, the chosen kofun in Kashihara was picked based on some textual and archaeological evidence, for example descriptions of the location in which Jimmu was buried. However, the designation was driven primarily by a political need for signals of respect to the imperial house, at a point when the government of the Tokugawa shogunate was teetering and losing legitimacy and in desperate need of support from the imperial throne. It turned out, of course, that the shogunate's problems were a bit bigger than one simple nice gesture could fix, and eventually the shogunate did collapse. When it did, the new Meiji government reconfirmed the chosen location as the official tomb of Emperor Jimmu, and you will still see it labeled as such on maps today. Yet the designation of this kofun as an emperor's tomb did not actually make the site available for what we'd call religious purposes. In fact, under the rules of the Meiji government, rules that still exist today, all of the kofun associated with the imperial house are direct property of the imperial house, and thus are not open to the public. They cannot be disturbed without permission. Thus, while there were calls by the late 1870s to set up a shrine associated with the Jimmu kofun, Kashihara Shrine actually has its origins in a very different initiative. By the late 1880s, the Home Ministry, the most powerful wing of the pre-World War II bureaucracy, had begun plans to search for a site that should have been, based on the records of the ancient histories, pretty close to Jimmu's tomb, his actual palace. Initially, the plan had been to locate the palace and set up a sort of historic marker, maybe a museum, not a shrine. Though to be fair, the distinction between the two was a bit fuzzy during this period. You see, one of the ways in which the government got around the religious freedom clause of the Meiji Constitution and navigated the whole Westphalian concept of religion was by labeling sites associated with Shinto, and especially Shinto sites that were supported by the government, as being cultural or historic sites. The government couldn't show obvious favoritism to a religious site or a religious practice, for example by compelling students from a school to go there, but a cultural practice, that can be compulsory. Eventually, the site that was chosen was just southeast of Mount Unebi, picked because it resembled descriptions in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. It was picked by actually the prefectural government at first, and initially the plan had just been for a monument or a marker, but before long the Home Ministry decided it wanted control of the site, and agreed to sponsor the project, but also pushed for the site to become a shrine rather than just a museum or something like that. Eventually, the Home Ministry bureaucrats who decided to make this a shrine ended up muscling out many of the local organizers who'd actually picked out the Kashihara site in the first place. Those local associations proved to be a little bit too hard to control to effectively be worth it. In fact, in 1903, the leadership of Kashihara Shrine would successfully lobby the national government in Tokyo to remove legal recognition of some of the local historical societies that had helped pick out the site of Kashihara Shrine in the first place. Those local historical societies simply had too many complaints about how things were being presented. Anyway, by the spring of 1889, around the same time the Constitution was first being promulgated, plans were being laid to construct a shrine at Kashihara, and Kashihara Shrine itself was dedicated on April 2, 1890. The gods venerated therein would be the spirit of the first emperor himself, as well as his empress consort and mother of the second emperor Suize, the somewhat verbosely named Hime Tatada Izusuhime. Now, as a quick aside, we should talk here about the system used to rank these shrines because it will be important down the line. During the Edo period, there had been some attempts to assert standardization among Shinto shrines by means of a licensing and ranking system managed by two aristocratic families, the Yoshida and Shirakawa, who would grant licenses to shrines that practiced correct Shinto and paid the associated licensing fees. Those licenses did come with special privileges, most notably related to taxation, but the Yoshida and Shirakawa lacked the ability to force shrines to seek licenses, and in fact most didn't. All of that changed with the Meiji Restoration. The Great Promulgation Campaign, of course, had tried to rework Shinto into a state religion, but even after its failure, the government remained very involved in organizing the affairs of any Shinto shrine that it could somehow find a way to label as a cultural institution. Smaller shrines were generally left alone. They were labeled as sectarian Shinto shrines and had all of the legal limits associated with other religious institutions. They couldn't be promoted in schools, they couldn't receive government support. However, any major shrine was designated as a cultural institution and was regulated by the powerful Home Ministry, with a couple of exceptions. For example, Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, which venerates those who died in service in the Japanese military, was regulated by the War Ministry. The Home Ministry, in turn, published a carefully graded ranking system dividing these major shrines into imperial, national, and popular levels, with each of these in turn having various subgradations of their own. That grading system was actually at first a part of the Great Promulgation Campaign, but the Home Ministry kept it around as a way of determining, among other things, which shrines would get direct financial support from the state and which would be dependent on donations from parishioners, and of course there were far more shrines in that latter category than the former. That gradation system was never applied to the sectarian Shinto shrines, the smaller ones, and of course it was never applied to Buddhist temples at all. The justification for the ranking system, particularly after the Meiji Constitution, with its religious freedoms guarantee, was that this was a matter of cultural significance around the shrines themselves. It was a matter of public concern around preserving an important part of Japanese history. Many of the state-supported shrines were encouraged to build museums on site to play up the historical associations they had, rather than emphasizing religious ideas. They were encouraged to build infrastructure, sports fields, concert halls, that sort of thing, on their grounds to emphasize their secular role. Meiji Shrine in Tokyo is a great example of this to this day, with all of the attached facilities surrounding the shrine proper. Kashihara Shrine itself was in a very similar state. To this day, there is still a baseball stadium and a track field right next to its grounds, as well as a public garden nearby around Fukuda Pond. This is also why many of the shrines built or revamped around this time don't have gates that close at night. They were intended to be public spaces that were always accessible, like a park, compared to a Buddhist temple, which generally has walls and an imposing main gate that is shut, and which is really only supposed to be opened for parishioners or during regular operating hours. Various legal attempts to regulate Buddhist institutions, which we're not going to get into too much here because they're not directly relevant, focused much more on rules for determining the various ways those institutions could lose legal protections and be shut down, for example by engaging in inappropriate political speech. If you're wondering what that means, it's basically any speech that is not generic milquetoast patriotism. Kashihara Shrine received the rank of Greater Imperial Shrine, the highest possible tier excepting Ise Grand Shrine, which is in a whole rank all its own, thanks to its association with the divine ancestor Amaterasu herself. This labeling ensured Kashihara would get financial support from the government as well as the imperial family itself, and a degree of public prominence as well. For example, history textbooks written by the Education Ministry reported matter-of-factly that Kashihara had been Japan's first capital, and included artists' renderings of what the capital would have looked like, and of Jimmu himself performing the rituals of state inside it. Carly Shimizu actually translated one of those textbook accounts from 1921, which I'm going to quote at length from here to give you a feel for how the shrine presented its own history publicly. Quote, February 11th, 660 BC. Framed by the verdant slopes of Mount Unebi, Emperor Jimmu sat at Kashihara Palace, surveying the wide expanse of his newly established capital. Below him were arrayed his loyal retainers, many of whom had made the long, difficult trek eastward from Himuka to at last settle here at the center of the land of the rising sun. Foremost among them was Ame no Tomi no Mikoto, the chief ritualist, and Ame no Taneko no Mikoto, prime minister. At the gates stood the imperial guard, washed clean of blood and dirt. Their bronze helmets shone in the sunlight, reflecting golden rays like the wings of the golden kite that had reflected the morning sun to blind the enemy at the Battle of Tomi. Jimmu looked up towards the sun. While bandits still roamed distant lands, here at the center, the citizens of Yamato could at last lay down their heads in safety and peace. All this was due to the benevolence of his ancestress, Amaterasu Omikami, who had given this land's great treasure, the people, into Jimmu's care. From today, he vowed, a new age of peace and security would begin, and the work of heaven would one day expand to all the 8 corners of the world. Emperor and subject alike bowed in reverence as voices rose in chorus, May this reign be unshakable for 1,000, yea, for 8,000 generations. Here and now the cornerstone of the great Japanese empire is laid. This language, of course, is intended to draw a direct link between Jimmu's capital and Japan as it existed in 1890. The emperor is the protector of the people and provides them with peace and security, something that of course had very much been lacking in the chaotic final years of the shogunate. He had extended his benevolent imperial rule over his great treasure, the people, by virtue of divine providence. The little speech at the end is, of course, directly quoting part of Kimigayo, the national anthem itself. The whole message is abundantly clear. Japan's greatness today is built on the same foundation as Kashihara Jingu itself. More mundanely, the expansion of the shrine included plans for the extension of the local rail network to nearby Unebi Station, so that this public monument to the nation's history and greatness could easily be accessible to anyone who wanted to visit it. And again, I really have to note here that the historical record that this supposed cultural institution is built on is, at best, difficult to prove, let's put it that way. Jimmu's own historical existence is basically considered by all legitimate historians to be completely unbelievable, and archaeological surveys of Kashihara turned up plenty of evidence of habitation of the region, but that's not surprising given the location, and it certainly doesn't prove that this is the site where the Japanese Empire was founded. But then again, historical accuracy was not the point of Kashihara Shrine or this whole system of Shinto cultural institutions. The purpose was to use the shrine to help create a certain narrative of Japanese history as having this antiquated pedigree stretching into an imagined golden past, a golden past whose glories were now being matched by a government that had put power back where it belonged, in the hands of the imperial family that had first built the Japanese state. Some of the shrine's own materials either implied or pretty directly stated this connection between the imperial past and present. For example, one pamphlet written by the chief shrine priest Uta Shigemaru, using, he claimed, and this is a direct quote, modern research methods, depicted the founding of Kashihara by showing Jimmu moving from his original home in Kyushu to the region of Kashihara via an airship. He exposited that, quote, at the time of Ninigi no Mikoto, the country was still undeveloped and the people's hearts were pure, but now, in the faraway countries over there are bad people who conduct themselves selfishly. Thus, the good people cannot lay their heads down safely to sleep. This is very pitiful. Of course, it's easy to laugh this off as fanciful nonsense for the gullible, but you can also see this kind of work as making a case that modern technology was not actually just unique to the new imperial Japan, but that modernity had been Japanese all along. The Meiji period was more of a rediscovery than an adopting of ideas from the outside world. So Kashihara Shrine straddled some weird boundaries. It was a site whose whole existence was grounded in the interpretation of Japanese history, but whose design was intended to be modern, and which was intended to take on this role as a public space. It was a place for religious veneration in all the traditional senses of that term, with shrine priests and prayers offered to the enshrined gods, all the things you expect from a Shinto site, but which also publicly presented itself as a historical marker that was more about honoring this important moment in the abstract. Kashihara Shrine is, of course, just one of many shrines. Just the first rank of imperial shrines alone had 57 institutions, plus another 6 shrines that were in colonial territories and thus no longer exist. But it's interesting to look at Kashihara in particular because of its associations with the foundational figure of Emperor Jimmu, and because unlike many of those other major shrines, which included places like Fushimi Inari Shrine, Izumo Shrine, Yasaka Shrine, places like that, Kashihara was entirely a creation of the Meiji era. It didn't exist before 1890. And that meant that the people who were creating Japan's shrine system didn't have to modify an existing space to fit what they were looking for. They could take advantage of this opportunity to create from whole cloth a new shrine in their desired image. So Kashihara is very revealing of how the leadership of the imperial state wanted to navigate the complexities of Shinto and its religious roots, while also carefully crafting a narrative of Shinto as an expression of the national character and culture, and thus not religious, of course, but purely cultural and subject to no legal restrictions. Next week, we'll see a very similar dynamic play out with one of Hokkaido's very first major Shinto shrines, but that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. To find out more about this show and our other shows, you can go to facingbackward.com. You can also support the History of Japan podcast on Patreon. Thank you very much to all of my beloved patrons who've donated to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.